Hi, Ben.
Howdy.
So over the last couple of weeks, you've been making this point that there's no moral equivalency between what Hamas did on October 7 and what Israel's response has been. But do you think there is a point at which the civilian death toll no longer justifies the actions of Israel, or do you think that alternatively Israel can justifiably kill every last civilian as long as its goal is to destroy Hamas?
So Israel should do its best to avoid killing civilians in destroying Hamas. However, there is no number where it goes from every life obviously being valuable. There's no number, however, where it goes from 10,000 to 10,001, at which point it has entered the realm of disproportion. That's not how war works. If war worked that way, no one would ever win one. It also completely destroys, I talked about incentive structures, it destroys the incentive structure for military units to act in ways that do not put civilian lives in danger, to allow Hamas immunity by dint of the fact that they are deliberately hiding among civilian populations. If you actually want people to not hide among civilian populations, then there have to be serious penalties to those groups for doing that sort of thing. Providing a ceasefire to the terrorist group as they hide under the ground is precisely the reverse of that.
But do you not realize that in using Hamas's disregard for civilian life to justify Israel's action, you are establishing the same equivalency that you are rejecting?
Please explain.
If you say that Hamas is hiding behind civilians, therefore we have a right to go after Hamas, despite the fact that we will get a lot of civilians in the way, you're using the fact that your enemy is evil to justify your own evil action.
No, I'm lamenting the fact that the enemy is evil. That's a different thing. I'm lamenting the fact that Hamas is hiding beneath civilians, and I'm suggesting that if Israel has to get done what it has to get done, that lies with Hamas. That's not, it's not, the death of civilians here is unjustifiable across the board, but is blameworthy on Hamas's part. There's a difference between death being justifiable in these circumstances in the sense that it's ever morally praiseworthy or good, and where you place the blame for that death. I mean, that's a pretty obvious moral point. I mean, to suggest that it's somehow a celebration of the death of civilians to point out that Hamas is hiding beneath them is to miss the point entirely. The entire point is that it's horrifying what Hamas is doing. If Hamas wants to end this all today, all they have to do is surrender. That's literally all they have to do. They have to walk out of the tunnels with their arms up and hand the hostages back to the Israelis, and this all goes away literally tomorrow. So all of this moral heartburn that people are having over Israel attempting to destroy a terrorist group that just murdered 1,500 civilians in their beds, including babies burned alive in ovens. The heartburn over that, because Hamas has simultaneously mistreated its own citizens, and so that's somehow Israel's responsibility. So Israel has to allow its own civilians to be put at risk because Hamas is deliberately putting its civilians at risk. Hamas is the governing body in the Gaza Strip. They've robbed their own citizens blind to the tune of billions of dollars. They have a $500 million investment portfolio in real estate around the globe, while 80% of their citizens are living in poverty. They took all the water pipes out of the ground and carved them into rockets, and somehow Israel is supposed to stop from deposing them because they're so cruel to their own civilians? That logic doesn't work in any way, shape, or form.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question on the topic of universal basic income. So last year, Andy Burnham, the mayor of Greater Manchester, said that universal basic income was an idea whose time had come, as he spoke on the cost of living crisis. Today, the Welsh government is running a pilot guaranteed income scheme, and England has just launched a similar trial. Do you believe that universal basic income is something that can reduce poverty and guard the workforce from potential technological advances such as AI or automation?
I'm not a huge fan of the idea of universal basic income, except as a possible replacement for all the other welfare schemes. So if you were to take all the other welfare schemes, which are badly administered, and basically wrap them into one and call it UBI as a substitute or replacement, it still wouldn't be my ideal, but I think that it might be better. As far as the effect of universal basic income, the question obviously is at what level? How much does it disincentivize work? There have been various attempts at this. Some have been discontinued because they've been failures. Others are still continuing, obviously. And so we're waiting to see the impact or effect of that. The other problem is that when you give a universal basic income to everyone, the natural effect of that is to increase prices, which requires more universal basic income, which requires increased prices, which requires more universal basic income. Helicopter money tends to create inflation. I know that's something that over the past 40 years seemed to be not a concern, but obviously now it's a major concern. And it turns out that when you just spend money through a fire hose, as every Western government did in the year 2020, 2021, 2022, that increases prices. Well, essentially, 2020 was a great experiment in universal basic income. In the United States, everybody just got paid to stay home. I mean, the government just blew out the money, and we're still seeing the effects of that. So I have a hard time believing that a solid, real universal basic income for millions of people wouldn't have a similar effect on price wage spirals, on disincentivization of work, and on the fiscal health of the country.
Okay, but do you not believe that, firstly, during the pandemic, we saw this huge increase in welfare payments with very little changes in taxes? If anything, there was less taxation. And by providing a universal basic income, we're giving individuals the opportunity to choose and decide what they decide to spend their money on, and whether they want to allocate that on health or on education. And does that not align with the liberal values which you so regularly preach?
So, I mean, again, as a substitute for other forms of welfare, I generally agree. I also see a train running down the track, which is what happens when a lot of people use their universal basic income to buy lotto tickets, which is one of the problems, right? Very, very often in the United States, for example, our welfare programs are means tested, and they are very often specifically allocated to particular goals. So, for example, EBT cards in the United States are for food stamps. You can only use them for particular products. Giving people cash, if they spend their cash on things that keep them in poverty, and then come back to the government with their handout saying, well, I didn't pay for my health care, I didn't pay for my kids' schooling, I didn't pay for the school books, but I definitely paid for my lottery ticket. I have a feeling the same people who are now advocating for universal basic income will be looking back to the government to fill that gap again.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
And one quick, smaller question. The UK is slowly phasing out certain types of knives. By phasing out, I mean making illegal to hold. What do you think about that? Because those knives are... There's no reason for a person to carry them as a British citizen. But
I mean, I don't know enough about knife policy in the UK. In the United States, we have, tanks, so.
Thank you so much for your time. My question is sort of going back to the topic of Israel and Palestine, and specifically focused on Resolution 242. And just to give a context to the audience, like what Resolution 242 is. So in 1967, the United Nations passed Resolution 242, and this legislation requested that Israelite armed forces retreated from the territories occupied during the recent conflict.
From territories occupied, yes, not the territories.
Yes.
It's actually a real distinction in the law.
Yes,
it makes a big difference, actually.
Yeah, sorry. And it also stressed the importance of resolving the refugee issue justly, and also encouraged the end of the belligerency claims in states. However, the resolution did not explicitly state which territories Israel had to withdraw from because of the ambiguities in the language of the English version versus the French version. And this ambiguity kind of is being used as a resolution, by the Israelites to justify its continued occupation of some territories. And furthermore, although the resolution mentioned a just resolution for the refugee issue, it failed to clearly address the right of the Palestinian people to statehood. And from my understanding, that is the reason why a lot of the Arab nations sort of reject that resolution. So my question for you is, if you were in their shoe, if you're a Palestinian, aware that there's impreciseness within the resolution that will potentially put your people in disadvantage, how would you respond to that, and whether you will accept a partisan deal or will you reject it? And before you answer, I'm ready to be destroyed by Ben Shapiro.
So, I mean, the answer, if I were a Palestinian citizen, which fortunately I'm not because it's horrible to live under the Palestinian Authority or Islamic Jihad or Hamas, but if I were, I hope that what I would be doing is pressing for a full-scale attempt at a peace deal that would involve a two-state solution. The biggest problem with the two-state solution right now is that one side wishes to exist and the other side wishes it not to, and that's a serious problem. So if that were to alleviate, there's been heavy movement for decades in Israel for ceding territory, which is why Yasser Arafat was in charge of areas of the West Bank, which is why the Gaza Strip, which was completely ceded to the Palestinians in 2005. Israel removed 8,000 Jews from the Gaza Strip in 2005. They did not have internal military presence in the Gaza Strip, which is why they didn't actually have any intelligence as to what was going on October 7th. And so the obvious answer would be that if a Palestinian government were to arise that were trustworthy and credible in its pledges not to actually attack and use their new state as a base for attack. And that would require time and trust, and that would have to be built up over time given the amount of distrust in the region, which would allow for presumably gradually increasing control of borders with, say, Jordan, right? If you're talking about the West Bank, it would also require land swaps. I mean, all these things have been discussed by Israel before. They were proposed in 2008 by Ehud Olmert. Mahmoud Abbas literally got up and walked away from the table without a counteroffer. So when it comes to the practicality of solution, that rests on whether the Palestinians are willing to have a government government at any point that would actually make that peace deal. And it was interesting. I was at Oxford last night, the other university. I was there last night, and student after student got up and asked about this, and then I asked them a simple question. They kept talking about occupied Palestine. I said, what do you mean by occupied Palestine? And invariably to a man or woman, each one of them said, everything. Like from the river all the way to the sea, that's occupied. Well, you can't make peace on that basis, of course, obviously. So, you know, as far as whether Israel's been willing to do it, yes, Israel will be willing to do that. But again, that's going to take time, it's going to take credibility. That's what Oslo was supposed to do, and it never even came remotely close to achieving that credibility, largely because Yasser Arafat is one of the worst people who has ever lived and an arch terrorist.
So what would be like sort of your solution to that? What would you propose if you're the one that's mitigating the deal between Israel and Palestine?
I mean, right now there's no deal to be actually mediated between the
just
two parties.
Hypothetical scenario.
In the magical hypothetical deal, it would end up looking like the Palestinian areas that are currently governed by that are currently largely Palestinian would end up under Palestinian control. It would look like land swaps, probably, where the Israeli areas outside the Green Line, like Afra, which has 30,000 citizens living out there, that was not going to end up in Palestinian control. You're going to have a land swap somewhere else. I mean, that's everybody sort of acknowledges that is the way that it would go. Even Likud, which started off anti-Oslo, once that was the reality on the ground, started to embrace a lot of the language of the two-state solution. So, again, I think that everyone in the West is trying to jump to the solution without recognizing the failure of the premise. If you have two parties who are willing to make a deal is available. And if you only have one party who's willing to make a deal is not available. Right now, only one party is willing to make a deal. The other party has shown itself repeatedly, literally for all of Israeli history, unwilling to make a deal. There's not been a single deal accepted by the Palestinian Arabs or by their predecessors. When I say their predecessors, I mean the Arabs who were in Palestine but didn't consider themselves nationally Palestinian at the time, people who were Syrian, people who were Turkish. The Peel Commission in 1937 recommended a significantly smaller state of Israel. The Jews accepted it. The Arabs rejected it. This has happened over and over and over. 37, 48, happened again in 2000, happened again in 2008. Over and over and over and over. So, again, it all comes back to the same point. Once there's a peace partner, you can talk. Until there's a peace partner, there's no talks.
Thank you so much. I feel being destroyed, but thank you.
Thanks. I'll start by quoting one of your videos. You say, I know it's, by the way, my question's on climate change.
Okay.
You say...
Thank you for allowing me to prepare myself.
So you're saying, I know it's hot outside. You know what I can do about it? 0 things. Thank God we have this thing called air conditioning. It's awesome. You know, it's a great cure when it's super duper hot being in a first world country. So I agree that as an individual, you actually have no power to mitigate global capitalism-induced ecological breakdown. Therefore, I'm curious about your views on structural government policies, such as net zero strategies, especially having in mind that this year we saw devastating wildfires in North America and Australia, which is the first world, and that also sadly burned the houses with the said air conditioning.
Yeah. Rồi đối với cái dao động 2 thì độ lệch cực đại của nó từ đây đến đây. Rồi từ đây đến đây. Được chưa ạ? Các bạn chú ý điều đó nha. Như vậy hai cái đồ thị này nó có cùng biên độ dao động. Đúng chưa? Chúng ta nói biên độ dao động A1 nè bằng biên độ dao động A2 và thầy đặt nó bằng A đi. Được chưa? Rồi người ta yêu cầu mình so sánh ly độ của hai dao động 1 và 2 tại mỗi thời điểm khác nhau. Bây giờ thầy nói tại thời điểm T bằng 0 thì chúng ta coi x1 của chúng ta nó nằm đâu nha. x1 là cái màu xanh thì x1 ngay vị trí này. Đúng chưa? x1 tại thời điểm T bằng 0 đây thì x1 ngay đây. Còn x2 của chúng ta nằm ngay đây tức là bằng trừ A. Như vậy x1 bằng 0, x2 bằng trừ A. Được chưa? Rồi tại thời điểm T bằng delta T. Delta T là ngay vị trí này nè các bạn. Ngay vị trí này đây. Thì chúng ta sẽ suy ra được x1 của các bạn đây. x1 của chúng ta. Tại thời điểm delta T đây. x1 nó nằm ngay vị trí này. Đây chiếu vào nó là biên. Như vậy x1 bằng A. Nhưng x2 của các bạn coi tại thời điểm delta x2 nó nằm ngay vị trí màu đỏ này luôn. Như vậy ngay vị trí biên luôn. x2 bằng 0. Rồi tiếp tục. Chúng ta so sánh tiếp tại cái thời gian là T. Được chưa? Tại thời gian là T nha. Đây vị trí này đây. Tại thời điểm này T nó nằm đây chứ không phải nằm đây nha các bạn. Tại thời điểm T này đây. Tại khi thời gian nó bằng T thì chúng ta suy ra x1. x1 là màu xanh. Màu xanh thì tương ứng nó bằng 0. đúng không ạ? Còn x2 là màu đỏ thì tương ứng x nó bằng là trừ A.